Okay, cool. Hi everyone. Welcome to the IAPSS Asia and Oceania SRC and IAPSS Political Theory lecture series. So today I will be giving the lecture. I'm Simran Borges. I am from the Asia and Oceania SRC group. So I am an undergrad student at the University of New South Wales, and I'm studying international studies and media, majoring in communication and journalism. So for today's lecture, I'm going to sort of be going through and analysing states during a crisis and looking at race and class disparities that were presented during COVID-19, and looking at that sort of from that Australian perspective. So I just... Yeah. So I will split this lecture into 4 main parts. The first quarter, I'm sort of just going to be going through states during a crisis, looking at, the methodology and psychology behind that and how states operate and what happens during crisis and just the broader response. And then moving forward, I'll go talk about the COVID-19 effect, so how that sort of changed how states and governments responded to crises. And in that, I'll kind of be looking at this whole idea of the state of emergency and how that sort of played into responses to COVID-19. And then I'll sort of hone in my focus of COVID in Australia and look at how Australia's government responded to that, what were sort of the methods and policies that were enacted during that time, and kind of go through that response. And then lastly, I'll sort of tie it in with looking at race and class in Australia during COVID-19 and how, even though, the government's response to the pandemic was outlined as one thing, how race and class inevitably sort of underpinned that and what the result of that was. So firstly, if we look at, just broadly states during a crisis, COVID-19, so in 2020, countries and governments all around the world were plunged into unison into what started out as a public health crisis, right? COVID-19, the virus. So this was rather complex though, because what started out as this public health crisis quickly divvied into an economic and political one, and all of this was sort of happening at the same time. So for those in the social science and political theory fields, like I'm sure many of us here and listening are from, this gave us that unique chance to experience firsthand how states respond to and manage a crisis, but on that unprecedented scale. So in this first quarter, like the states during the crisis, I just kind of want to expand on this broader idea a little bit more, and that is looking at the methodology and psychology behind states during crisis. So I'll draw you first to this quote, which sort of explains very generally what happens during a crisis. So this is from the CRC organization, which is a US-based organization. So in a crisis, affected people take in information, process information, and act on information differently than they would during non-crisis times. People or groups may exaggerate their communication responses. They may revert to more basic or instinctive flight or fight reasoning. So I think if we look at this quote, it is very, very clear how much it resonates with the way governments responded to COVID during the pandemic and during this crisis. If we look at the first half of the quote, how people take in information, process information, and act on information, that was something that governments had to do, right? Taking information about what the virus is, how do we, use this to inform public health policies and ensure that citizens of different nations are protected from the virus, and also how economies can be protected from this virus and act on that accordingly, right? And that's different during non-crisis time. So we see that in the way that emergency powers were enacted, so travel bans, restrictions, all that sort of stuff. And then that also kind of goes into this next part of the quote, which is exaggerating communication responses, right? Because governments had to make these decisions on rapid scales and rapid speeds, there was no time to sort of like think out and play through how this would happen months ahead, because it just had to be now, right? Like that was the point. So this kind of inflicts into this idea of state of emergency, right? So there's this other quote by Gray et al., and they kind of say politicians from all across the political spectrum have used the power of the state to restrict movement and constrain economic activity. And it is not clear if these current trends are a short-term response or if there will be a reset within the government's role in the economy and society altered permanently. So again, this whole idea of rapid decision-making and communication and response. If we go now to the whole idea of emergency laws and state of emergency, I'm sure this is an idea that many of you have come across before. It essentially is like, the suspension of the basic rule of law to an extent, of course, when crises emerge. But I think what we're seeing here and what we have seen during COVID is that these have almost extended to this constant state of emergency where there's no definite end. And so it kind of raises the impacts as to what happens when we sort of plunge into these extended periods of crisis, which I think we can all sort of agree that COVID was one of those. So now if we go to the COVID-19 effect, so this plays very, very well, right? Because we saw this idea of a lot over the past few years, especially with governments trying to scramble to keep on top of all the new developments that came with COVID-19 and, social, political, economical, cultural. States had to work at undeniably rapid speeds to ensure that the risk to populations, as well as the economy, remained relatively minimal, right? Now, whether they actually achieved that is a different issue, but I will get into that a bit later. So during the thick of COVID, many states adopted, as I previously mentioned, these emergency measures, right? So those back-end policies and decisions that they would really only have to have taken when severe crises emerge, which COVID undeniably was. So as I said, on the broader spectrum, these emergency measures, which included, restrictions on movement, we saw international travel bans, national travel bans, lockdowns. During any other time, these would have been extremely drastic, right? So if you told any given population 5 years ago that, there would be a time where people were banned from leaving their country, would we have even believed that, right? So now we can all agree that these emergency measures were, of course, in the name of public health, right? And therefore they were necessary to ensure the well-being of nations as a whole. That doesn't disregard the fact they did technically impede to a certain extent on citizens' rights. Now, I can only speak from the perspective of someone from a democratic country, but I think there was indeed this ongoing debate throughout the past few years about the reaction of the government during this crisis, especially as it treaded that fine line between, using emergency powers for the sake of public health versus affecting citizens' rights. Now, personally, and I think most of you listening might probably agree, I never really understood the latter, because during times of crisis and states of emergency, it does remain the fundamental role of the state, of the government, to take the wheel, so to say, and make those rapid decisions. I mean, after all, that is essentially the point of having these centrally allocated governments, right? To make these emergency decisions when crises emerge. So now, if we look to COVID, kind of honing in on COVID and Australia specifically, Australia definitely did struggle with COVID. We went through multiple waves, as I'm sure many other countries went through, specifically New South Wales and Victoria, which are two of the largest cities. So I would say they definitely took the brunt of COVID cases and restrictions and emergency government responses. And in the beginning, Australia actually did fare slightly better, I guess I would say, to its other counterparts. And that as well had to do with the government's shutdown of the international border, as well as shutdown of the national border, which was an emergency decision that had not been enacted since 1919 during the Spanish flu. So I guess that kind of reflects the severity, maybe that's the wrong word, but the extent to these emergency powers. So as of today, Australia has recorded just under 5 million COVID cases, and that's since 2020, so since the beginning of the pandemic, and around 6,000 deaths. People hospitalized, and that's across all states, 89 in the ICU and 25 currently on ventilators. The highest number of cases was between the 20 to 39-year-old age category, and females in that had a higher case rate than men. And in terms of mortality rates, we saw that highest within the 80 to 89-year-old category, and men have a higher mortality rate in that category. Now, in terms of the country's economic response, roughly the Australian government spent around $291 billion in direct economic support as of May 2021. And over the past 2 years, there have been several policies introduced by the government aimed specifically for this crisis and helping citizens and businesses sort of come out of it. So just a few that I picked up on were the pandemic leave disaster payment, which was essentially a payment to workers who couldn't work because they had to isolate because of COVID-19. So that was a payment given to them. There was also the COVID-19 business support payment, and that was to all eligible businesses to receive payments of up to $100,000 per week based on how much they were losing because of the impacts of COVID. There was also the Home Builder program, and that was essentially targeted towards first home buyers, sort of encouraging that they keep that ongoing, like trying to encourage them to buy their homes and keep that market flowing. And there was also the JobKeeper payment, which was to help keep Australians in jobs during COVID-19. But now, regardless of all these economic policies and political decisions, there inevitably remained the issue. I don't know if say it was an invisible issue, but it was definitely an underlying issue of race and class. And throughout all these, different decisions that were made, underpinning those were all the effects and of different race communities and different class categories and how they were affected. So yeah, so again, we can discuss at length all these economic and political responses of Australia during the COVID pandemic. But yeah, it does remain vital to acknowledge those race and class disparities that were, whether intentionally or not, dramatically highlighted during this whole period, right, from 2020 to even now, 2022. So for one, racism in Australia just definitely saw a dramatic spike with anti-Asian hate, particularly targeted at those from Chinese backgrounds. Wang 2001 also identifies very specific cases of Chinese students actually being physically attacked by strangers in Melbourne's CBD. She also includes in Western Australia an incident of a supermarket employee actually preventing customers from entering the store who had an Asian look. Now, these are very specific cases, but they are not isolated incidents. And I only mentioned two, but there were numerous cases of this outright and blatant racist attacks. And that wasn't even related necessarily to government responses. That was just an attitude that was born outside of the whole public health crisis. So governments in that way didn't even have a direct response, but it was just what we saw happening within society. And then the issue with that in Australia is that Australia, we have an act, it's called the Racial Discrimination Act, which was put forward in 1975, which technically deems racism as unlawful, but it is a very precarious and opaque act. So it's very unclear as to what constitutes as that, and to determine whether someone can be punished for these acts of racism. So that was also another issue. Now, this race disparity was not only carried out by these, blatant racist attacks, but they were also reflected in the state government's response to the situation. So in New South Wales and Sydney specifically, the area that bore the brunt of most of the state's restrictions and these emergency decisions and emergency powers that governments were enacting was an area, so west and southwest of Sydney. Now, these areas also happen to have severely low income areas, and they also have the city's most culturally and linguistically diverse communities, or CALD, C-A-L-D communities. So within these communities, it's not uncommon to have multi-generational households, multiple people living in the same home. You've got grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren. And what happens then, it makes it harder to isolate, right? When you have these households and you have people going to work and coming back and someone has COVID, where do you find the room to say everybody go to their own quarters and isolate for 14 days? It's very, very, very difficult. So then what you see in those areas as well is a concentration of jobs within blue collar industries, so manufacturing, construction, retail, aged care, which all involve a lot of labor, right? And then these in Australia, or New South Wales anyway, were considered essential services in New South Wales. So these communities and these individuals and these groups had to go into work. Working from home was never an option. It was never a luxury. So in that way, it's very clear to see how indirectly government responses to, we encourage people to work from home, but that doesn't necessarily stick, and that doesn't necessarily affect or reflect communities in these areas. And that was also, it's hard to determine whether it was directly related to class or race, but it was, an inevitable effect. There were also issues with language barriers that impacted people's ability to access adequate health services. So we're looking at health literacy, right? Because in these areas in Sydney and also elsewhere within Australia, I'm just using Sydney specifically because I have direct experience there. You had communities in the southwest and western areas of Sydney where families couldn't speak English or they didn't understand English. So when health communication was being relayed to them, it wasn't being understood. And then in that way, you have to question then what is the impact of the government response in that way? Is it really having an impact? And how are governments considering these differences? So yeah, again, health literacy and then receiving and understanding important health orders compared with wealthy individuals from different parts of the state and non, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So that definitely had an impact in that way. So social scientist Julie Leesks from UCID, she said in a statement, so this is the quote that I've included: "Some families will have 2 people in a 2-story mansion, and some families will have 10 essential workers with 2 or 3 people in the same bedroom sleeping at night." And that sort of gives a broader idea of what the situation was like within communities where race and class was deeply entrenched, and the disparities that occurred between, these communities in one area of Sydney versus another area of Sydney. And this was only made worse by the fact that many restrictions and lockdowns in Sydney were unequally targeted toward these disadvantaged communities. And this was not only in Sydney, because in Melbourne, if we look to, so in Victoria, there were incidences, or there was one incident early on in the pandemic where you had 9 public housing towers, also with very high levels of ethnic and migrant populations, and they were ordered to shut down with very little notice in August 2020. It was very, very controversial to the fact that an official inquiry was launched by the Victorian government into this incident, which was hugely controversial. And they found that some residents had to sleep in their cars, they had run out of food, they had run out of supplies, and others reportedly self-harmed. So in that way, you sort of see that the government's response to this crisis, to this public health crisis, was it was received in very different ways by different members of the population. And that was, coming down to it, a matter of race and class, right? Because where people were situated in Sydney, for example, let's say you were in an area that was disadvantaged, the access to resources and support and the information that you could share or, understand was very different to someone in a wealthier suburb of Sydney, for example. So these racially diverse communities, so these vulnerable communities as well, also saw a dramatic increase in police and army presence, and that the government had used to justify as ensuring public health orders were abided by. But it left many, many vulnerable communities feeling all the more targeted, anxious, and divided. And that sort of, I guess, reflects this whole idea of, the disparities that emerged from this public health crisis, and the disparities from government responses, state government responses. And what makes it even worse is that there's very little representation in state governments, and maybe this is not just an Australia thing, to sort of really understand what these communities are going through and how can you enact policies and make decisions that adequately capture the experience and adequately support these vulnerable communities when you have no real lived experience about what it's going to be like and how these are going to carry out. So that was also, one of the major difficulties. And then, again, these are kind of made worse once you consider the quote. I found this quite shocking, but again, not completely surprised, that Australia's 31 billionaires saw their fortunes increase by nearly 85 billion since the pandemic began, and that was according to Oxfam. And we saw a similar thing in the United States, billionaires seeing their wealth increase compared to the millions of population elsewhere that were struggling during these times. So I guess kind of in a nutshell, that, it shows to some extent the issues that governments and states saw, and especially, in Australia specifically, when it came to race and class during COVID-19. Consideration into these consequences and how the okay, cool. Essentially, it kind of shows that in terms of states during crises, and specifically Australia's response during the COVID crises, that race and class were inevitably tied with the government's response. And although it wasn't necessarily direct, if you just go back to the economic policies that were enacted during that period, they didn't spell out, right? Like, oh, we're giving you these policies and these are going to affect CALD communities or low-income communities. They didn't exactly say that, but then I guess, did they really have to? Because it was inevitably going to be tied in, and it was going to be something that would be affected by these responses and these attitudes. I think that's something, and not only, I don't even think something that was Australia wide, it was something that was a global phenomenon, that, you know, these low-income communities and culturally diverse and ethnic populations and migrant populations bore the brunt of the crisis, I guess you could say, in a very unequal way. And again, you know, looking, you got those 4 points again. It's because they have the multi-generational households, the concentration of blue-collar jobs, issues with health literacy, and these large elder communities. So the dissemination of information to these communities and the way that, you know, the responses played out, and then how they had access, how much access they had to information, and how they as communities could respond to information was very, very unequal, and especially compared to wealthier parts of Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. And you also had Indigenous populations as well, that kind of groups into the same thing. So I think, yeah, overall, it's kind of very clear that these race and class disparities were one of the other crises that invariably came out of these government responses to COVID-19. So yeah, I'll draw it to there, the end. Yeah, so if anybody had any questions or comments.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was a little late. I hope you can forgive me that I missed out on some of your lecture because of that. So maybe I missed out on the answer to my question as well, but on one of the earlier pages, you had this idea of the crisis fostering more constrictive state behavior. And to that, I thought, on the one hand, yes, in Europe and the US, there has been a perceptible and maybe responsible interest in relaxing constraints on the economy, even more than on social behavior. But on the other hand, the idea of increasingly perpetuated crises had already been used since the 2008 financial crisis and the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 to justify controversial policies. However, these usually entailed rolling back government support for disadvantaged groups, often reducing states' compliance with human rights standards as well. Sort of like you explained about Sydney. So is this really a matter of constrictive state action, or isn't it rather a matter of state inaction that increases social inequity and economic inequity?
Sorry, Jodrick, I think I just cut out again. What was the question again?
You spoke earlier of the idea or the danger that states would enter, even after the pandemic, enter a constant crisis mode, and thus increase their constrictive policies that they enacted during the pandemic perpetually. But to me, like as well with your example of Sydney, it seems like it was more a matter of state inaction in the face of social inequity and increased social inequity in the face of the pandemic. So did I miss out on something, or do you just see it more of like a constrictive of constrictive political behavior anyways? Oh, well, that happens.
Maybe you could try typing your question, and she can definitely see it that way. Do we maybe have another question while we're waiting for that? Our first one. Yeah, he's typing his question now. We can wait for 1 minute. In the meantime, do we have any other questions? Apologies. Okay. Simran, can you see the question in the chat?
Oh, yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to read it out. So I'm just going to read out the question, Jendrik. All right. Spoke earlier about the danger of states perpetuating their constrictive policies in the face of a perpetuated crisis mode. But your example of Sydney and my perception of pandemic policy in the States and Europe implies state inaction in the face of increased social inequity fostered by the pandemic. So would you say that this is nevertheless a form of a constrictive state policy? Yeah, actually, when you put it like that, I guess it does make sense to think about it that way. Because when I was sort of writing up my understanding of these constrictive policies and I guess emergency powers or these sort of, suspension of rule of law policies, it was sort of that idea of those emergency powers that would have been enacted, would not nevertheless not have been enacted during like any other ordinary time. But then I guess, yeah, if you're thinking about the way that these emergency powers impacted these, communities and actually increased social inequalities and disparities, yeah, in a way, I guess they would be constrictive because you would think, yeah, because I guess there was that failure to consider the broader impact of it, despite the fact that, it was supposed to be, oh, okay, yeah, we need to make this decision now to ensure that the nation as a whole is protected now. And then I guess that also kind of raises questions then as to during these emergency powers and when they are enacted, the extent to which they really consider these broader social issues. Because I think, yeah, on a larger scale, whilst, they're sort of claiming to act in the name of like public health or in the name of the safety of the nation as a whole, whether that's really, I don't know, that's really true or that really happens in practice is, I guess, something, yeah, that's we would need to consider. But yeah, no, definitely great question. Yeah, Lisa, I can see the little hand.
Yeah, I guess it's more of amusing to comment on, but like from my time in Australia, what I've noticed is they kind of have this idea, the government tries to foster this national unity, all Australian, like we've seen it in responses to the bushfires or when there was the drought as well over in the East. So I'm kind of wondering, like, do you think that this idea of, it's a good way of trying to go about it, like the all Australian, we're all in it together, was that kind of shield the government a little bit, or do they use it as a shield from this kind of undercurrent of racism that's still very, very present in Australian politics, or at best a racial ignorance?
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, definitely great question, great observation. I think, yeah, you were saying, right, like in the beginning of the question, that whole rhetoric that was there, not even in Australia, but I think it was, we can all agree from wherever we are in the world that it was something that governments were pushing. The whole sentence of, oh, we're all in this together and we're going to get through this together. But in reality, maybe it was like that in the beginning because it was everyone was very disoriented and nobody really knew what was happening at the time. But I definitely think that with Australia anyway, when it got to that latter half, that tail end of COVID, I guess maybe, there was definitely a clear inequality in how states were responding or not responding to these vulnerable communities. And even, yeah, you mentioned the bushfires. That was probably maybe class related, right? Because you were looking at the rural communities that were really affected, and it was a very what's the word? It was a very unequal response to the bushfires and even floods, because these rural communities and these regional communities who were going through it, ultimately, I think they would agree that at the end of the day, the commitments and the promises and the policies that these states and governments had claimed that they were going to give didn't end up following through. And that was the same thing with the floods, which I'm sure you guys are all aware of currently in Australia that are happening. These regional communities who are the ones who are most affected, it was a really big issue because they weren't getting all these funds and these grants that the government had promised. So I definitely think that there's this veil of, oh, we're all in this together and, you know, we'll get through it together. But I think when it comes down to it, it is a matter, I think, of racial ignorance and also just ignorance as a whole as to how these communities are really affected. And I think, unfortunately, in Australia, it also comes down slightly to the politics of it all. And this is like just a very kind of specific example, but just, yeah, in relation to flood, like if when it was the floods or the bushfires, these areas that were getting affected, ultimately for the government in power, they weren't necessarily areas of interest, which is a terrible thing to say, but like, you know what I mean? Like they weren't necessarily seats or party seats that the government were interested in vetting. And I know that there was a particular case during, it was either the floods or the bushfires, where grants were, so currently the Liberal Party is in power. So grants were going to the rural and regional areas of New South Wales who were affected by the floods. So the grants were unequally going to those areas more than the opposition, where opposition was holding seats. Yeah, so in that way, I think as well, it was a combination of just ignorance and then also that politically motivated side of it. But yeah, definitely.
Do we have any other questions? I will take that as a no. Thank you very much for putting the presentation together, Simran, and it was well, following the news about Australia from various European news outlets, it was you know, kind of of a mixed perception of what is happening, with some people being okay with it, some people being not so fond of the lockdowns. But I was particularly interested in the race part of your presentation. Thank you for putting it together and for presenting and for the questions and the answers. So if that is all, I guess we can stop the recording now.
Yeah, cool.